the sharing of biased and
False news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish things they are true without checking facts first. Unfortunately, some members of the media platforms push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think, and this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Welcome back, and welcome to part 2 of this breakdown and presentation of Senate Hearing 104-593. I appreciate Laura over there at Magical Mystery Church making me aware of this. But we're going to move into part 2. In part 1, there was the opening statements from the committee members in the Senate Intelligence Committee that was headed up by Arlen Specter. We'll be returning back to him since he is chairman. And we finished it off with the statement and then the Q&A session with then Director of Central Intelligence, Deutsch. So let's go ahead and get on back to where we left off last time with moving into the segment where the journalist and the journalistic related people spoke. So moving right on into the introduction before Mr. Adelman goes into his statement. Chairman Specter said to Director Deutsch, "We appreciate you being here. I would like now to call the third panel in alphabetical order. Mr. Kenneth Adelman, Mr. Terry Anderson, Mr. Ted Koppel, and Mr. Mortimer B. Zuckerman." There's a brief pause. Mr. Adelman says, "Should I begin, Mr. Chairman?" Chairman Specter says, "In a minute. I want to introduce you properly, Mr. Adelman." Mr. Adelman says, "Thank you." Chairman Specter says, "I worked with you when you were at the administration before, but I wanted to be sure I got your credentials right, so I called for your resume." Mr. Adelman, "I'll give you 45 minutes to do so." Chairman Specter, "I can't do it in that short a time." There was general laughter. Chairman Specter says, "Mr. Adelman was director of the U.S. Arms Control Disarmament Agency for approximately 5 years, and I had considerable contact with him at that time on the critical questions of arms control. He accompanied President Reagan on superpower summits with President Mikhail Gorbachev. He had been Deputy U.S. Representative to the United Nations from 1981 to 1983 with the rank of Ambassador, second in command at that time to Ambassador Jean Kirkpatrick. His full resume will be included as a part of the record. He now serves as a columnist for the Washington Times, and I think it brings an unusual perspective from both government and journalism to this important question. Now, the floor is yours, Mr. Adelman. And we'll just scroll real quick through his credentials. Let's see. Kenneth L. Adelman was director of the United States Arms Control and Disarmament Agency for nearly 5 years, accompanying President Reagan on his superpower summit with Mikhail Gorbachev until leaving in December 1987. He had been Deputy U.S. Representative to the United Nations 1981 to 1983 with the rank of Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary. Okay, hang on. Second in command to John Patrick. All right, I have got to look up this word. What does that mean? Oh, invested with full power, or a relatively how do you pronounce that? Give me a pronunciation, please. Hang on, let me turn that on.
Plenipotentiary. Plenipotentiary. Plenipotentiary.
Okay, plenipotentiary. All right, so learn a new word. But invested with full power of or relating to plenipotentiary agent. So that would kind of link back to the deputy director, the concept of the deputy director of Central Intelligence having the authority to act on behalf of. So yeah, I get it now. So he was the number two guy as ambassador to, or the number two. Yeah. Anyway, moving back to the resume, called, quote, one of the most brilliant foreign policy minds around, end quote, by the Wall Street Journal. Ambassador Adelman was described by Pravda as, quote, a zoological anti-communist, end quote. Moscow's TASS news agency wrote, quote, Pharisaism, duplicity, and fabrication of falsehoods is a political hallmark of Mr. Adelman, end quote. Hang on. Let's go back and break that down. One of the most brilliant foreign policy minds around, according to Wall Street Journal. But he's described by Pravda, which is a Russian publication. And interestingly enough, the word Pravda directly translates from from Russian into English as truth. Huh. Anyway, as a zoological anti-communist. In other words, he's animalistic about being anti-communist. Wow. Okay. Quite the credentials. All right, let's get back to it real quick. He now pursues 1, writing, 2, teaching, and 3, corporate consulting in the international realm. Oh, a man of mystery and intrigue for sure. All right, I'm sorry, insertion there. In writing, he is a nationally syndicated columnist and national editor of the Washingtonian magazine, for which he does a monthly interview entitled, quote, What I've Learned, end quote. Besides hundreds of articles, he has published 4 books, Getting the Job Done in 1982, co-authoring The Defense Revolution with Norman Augustine, 1990, The Great Universal Embrace, 1989, and The African Realities, 1980, which drew upon his 2.5 years of living in Africa. What? Hang on. What is this? I've never heard of this. Somebody might need to look into this one. Make sure I get that right. Realities of... Oh, that's right. In the 80s, there was a lot of apartheid going on in Africa. All right, that would be African realities, yeah. But wait a minute, that would have... But apartheid was already in full swing in the 80s. I remember when the riots were happening in London in the late 80s after... I think it was after I left. After I came back to the States, getting discharged from the Air Force. And there were people that were protesting, even when I was there, when I'd go to London, Trafalgar Square. I know, I'm digressing. Trafalgar Square, the South African embassy was there, and there were always anti-apartheid riots going on, protests going on. And that was between 84 and 87. I was there more in 86. Anyway, back to his resume. This is an interesting character. I'm looking forward to getting into his statement. In teaching, he has a course on Shakespeare and a graduate course on national security studies, both at Georgetown University. He also is a featured public speaker and frequent television commentator. He is a founding member of the Sherlock Holmes Club in Washington, participated on the Zaire River expedition, a 3-month voyage down the Congo on the 100th anniversary of the Stanley's trip, and translated for Muhammad Ali during his 1974 heavyweight bout, the Rumble in the Jungle in Zaire. Okay, there's that Zaire reference. Oh, okay, I'm going to get back on course here. Adelman received his Bachelor of Arts from Grinnell College and both his master's and doctorate from Georgetown University. He now serves on the boards of the Princeton Review, IPAC, Newmeyer Associates, Freedom House, and the American Refugee Committee, along with his wife Carol and 2 daughters, Jessica 21 and Joycelyn 19. He lives in Arlington, Virginia, and there's address there and whatnot. So, I mean, it is a matter of, but what's IPAC? Information for Planning and IPAC Caltech. Intergovernment Payment and Collection as Treasury. Enterprise, I don't know. And I don't know what that is. Anyway, I digress. All right, let's go ahead and move on towards this statement. Statement of Kenneth Edelman, syndicated columnist. Syndicated, huh? Okay. Mr. Edelman, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's good to be back with the committee. I spent many happy hours on verification and on other important issues, worked very closely, and have great respect for the committee. Mr. Chairman, to allow the most time for questions, I would summarize my remarks in 4 points. Firstly, the whole controversy is interesting in what it says about the press. In many respects, we all work with the press. In many respects, we all work with the press, have respect for the press. But the level of self-absorption by the press is quite amazing always. This report by the Council on Foreign Relations, actually an independent task force of the Council on Foreign Relations, has important recommendations about the future intelligence and organizations. One slight sentence that applied something about the press became the critical sentence in this report. When you look at the whole controversy, you realize that the press will concentrate on whatever affects itself rather than, as I said, the substance of the issue. I wish we would have would have as elaborate a public discussion about the substance of the report than its a covert issue. Number 2, Chairman Spector cuts in, when you make that comment, would you amplify that just a bit? What would you like to see discussed on the report? Mr. Adelman, well, I think the parts about the economic intelligence are very interesting. The whole reorganization, the whole question of whether there should be the kind of cutbacks in the intelligence budget that we've seen in the Pentagon, or the quality of intelligence. I found, during most of my 12 years in the government, that intelligence was very good for verification of missile silos and future programs coming along. It was very weak when it came to summits or anticipating what Soviets were doing in the next round of arms talks. At Reykjavik, my Russian does not exist. I don't have it. Anyway, at Reykjavik, which I think was was one of the critical events of the Cold War. We were very surprised by what Mikhail Gorbachev did at Reykjavik, and I didn't think we should have been. There are other instances when intelligence could have been far better. Chairman Spector says, how might we improve that? That was certainly a classical event in October 1986. It was of enormous importance, really stands out. What could intelligence have done better there? Mr. Adelman says, there should have been some leap of creativity, and I say that with some responsibility on my part as well, that the situation of the Soviet Union warranted Gorbachev doing something dramatic rather than, as we assumed, to come and just say hello. It was after the Danilov affair, at a time to heal the relationship. All the interpretations and predictions of the summit were understandable, but they were all dead wrong. As it turned out, it was a wild and woolly weekend. I think that it was a very productive weekend, one that led to the decline and the collapse of the Soviet Union. It certainly was one of the greatest weekends of my life. Mr. Adelman says, now I'm going to cut in here for a second because let's take a look at what the Danilov affair was real quick. The Danilov affair was a diplomatic crisis that occurred in 1986 between the United States and the Soviet Union. It began on August 30th, 1986, when Nicholas Danilov, a Moscow correspondent for U.S. News and World Report, was arrested by the KGB and accused of espionage. On the background, Danilov was reporting on the Soviet Union for several years, and his arrest was seen as a retaliatory move by the Soviet government in response to the arrest of Gennady Zakharov, a Soviet employee of the UN mission 3 days earlier. And my cat just climbed up in my lap. Let's go ahead and close out this part of the statement. But, let's see, going back to Mr. Adelman. But my point is that for such an important event, intelligence should have been better. I've always liked the idea of competition in the intelligence realm. Not just having one flow of information about what might happen on judgments coming up to top decision makers. In other words, competing theories or approaches which are all too rare in intelligence findings. Those are the kinds of things the committee should really concentrate on. But one little sentence that doesn't even mention journalists in the Council on Foreign Relations report evokes the hearing and previous hearings and 3 or 4 editorials for the Washington Post, etc., etc. My second point is that this should be a non-issue. I agree that the current policy of the government is just fine. I think along with Senator Kerry, I don't know why any group of professionals should be exempt, whether journalists or clergy or even Peace Corps members, from cooperating with the CIA if they choose to do so. I have no problem requiring the same procedures used for covert operations. I listened closely to Director of Central Intelligence Deutsch, a man who I have known for years and have the utmost respect for. He explained why he's against the same procedure. Yet, the 3 reasons he gave to me didn't seem convincing, especially in the light of him saying that this happens very, very rarely, so it wouldn't be a burden to the agency. Point 3 is on the argument that this would taint journalists or endanger journalists. Journalists are already journalists are already tainted and endangered. When Senator Coverdell says that one of the Peace Corps volunteers in Bolivia was apprehended because he or she was suspected of being a DEA agent, that shows that no matter what your committee does or what the President of the United States does, and denying that any journalist or clergy or Peace Corpsman will ever be in the CIA or affiliated with the CIA, all those denials will be laughed off, ignored, or discounted, especially by the bad guys of the world. Solid truth, man. Anyway, back to the statement. These bad guys are the ones we care about, where human intelligence needs to penetrate because of possible terrorist attacks and weapons of mass destruction. Oh boy. Call him pal. Anyway, Mr. Adelman goes on to say, I see my red light is on. Let me end by saying one last thing. Yes, American journalists are journalists, but they are also Americans. I see no reason why they shouldn't feel some kind of civic responsibility when American lives are in danger and feel the urge to serve our country. Now, I know many of them do feel that civic responsibility. They should be allowed to act accordingly. It does not take great leaps of imagination to come up with scenarios of weapons of mass destruction putting lives in danger when they shouldn't. For a moment, step out of their role as journalists and care about our country and about saving lives. A few years ago, I interviewed Bob Woodward, who I considered one of the finest journalists. I asked him about the Janet Cook affair, which was his biggest error of the Washington Post in the last X number of years. He said the main thing he did wrong was think about this only as a journalist and never in those many discussions go out and find where Joey, the supposedly 12-year-old boy who was drugged, lived and whether he could be rehabilitated. Woodward learned that he should have stepped out of his role as an editor and journalist for a moment and showed concern on the human being behind the story. That was never done. Had he done so, he would have obviously saved himself from great error and would have done a tremendous service for his newspaper, as well as set a very good example for the kind of thing I'm talking about today, where American journalists serve America and help save American lives. Mr. Chairman Specter responds, thank you very much, Mr. Adelman. We have been joined by Senator Clergy. Do you care to make any comments, Mr. Clergy of Massachusetts? Senator Clergy of Massachusetts. Well, Mr. Chairman, the only comment I'd like to make is to express, I understand Bob Clergy may have expressed this also, I'm deeply concerned about the public hearing on this subject, to be candid with you. To whatever degree other governments may have questions about whether we do this or not, those questions may be best left without an articulation of policy. But here, it seems to me, if they weren't tainted before, they sure as hell will be tainted afterwards. Whatever doubt or question marks may have arisen, we sort of articulated it as a matter of policy. We may do this, which may leave us no choice but to suggest that there are certain areas where we shouldn't be doing it. I tend to be one of those who feels that most intelligence gathering can be done outside of this of the use of certain kinds of people. I tend to agree with Senator Coverdell that the kinds of things we are trying to achieve with the Peace Corps would be extraordinarily limited if people thought we were going to, as a matter of course, potentially use them as intelligence gatherers. So I would think the issue of clergy and others to be similarly tainted, and the flow of information and our desires for it would be hindered ultimately. So it may be that the statutory impact, so it may be that the salutary impact of this will be to elicit from us prohibition rather than have left it in doubt, as it has been up to now. But I am very uncomfortable with the public decisions or discussions, and that's all I would say at this point. Chairman Spector says, "Thank you, Senator Kerry." We'll now turn to Mr. Terry Anderson, who was at the bureau chief of the Associated Press in the Middle East and was taken hostage for a period of some 6 years from 1985 to 1991. We'll hear the circumstances from you, Mr. Anderson, in your own words as to what the impact was on you being a journalist and the representation or concern of your being a spy, as you said earlier in our private conversation, a spy for the CIA. The floor is yours. You may proceed. Statement of Terry Anderson, journalist. Mr. Anderson speaking. Sir, I would like to begin by saying I share Senator Kerry's and Coverdell's concern about this public discussion at all. It makes me uncomfortable. The damage has already been done. I believe most prominently by Director Deutsch's acknowledgement that there was a director's option, that there were exceptions to the general rule, and that such things had happened in the past. So, the best thing that we can do, I think, is to try to repair the damage by a greater prohibition without exceptions. Yeah, like prohibition works, right? Back to his statement. We are talking about a real danger. This is not imaginary. Both as personal experience and in my duties as the director of the Committee to Protect Journalists, I know that journalists are put in danger by the perception that they are connected to intelligence agencies. We all know that in much of the world, the CIA is viewed with great suspicion and distaste, and that journalists in these same places begin with the presumption on the part of many people that they are somehow connected with intelligence gathering. Can't imagine why. He goes on to say, I've been accused of being a spy, not just on the occasion of my captivity, but on other occasions in various places. I was told by a number of people that I was on a list of the CIA agents kept by the fundamentalist Shiites who captured me. That is the perception that is very difficult to disprove. It's hard to argue with them. They are very suspicious people. On a more general sense, I would like to make a couple of points, if I may. If we are making rules for anyone, part of the consideration has to be the behavior of the people to whom the rules will apply. If they are generally orderly, obedient, and respectful of the rules, then we can afford to make the rules somewhat less tightly and provide for exceptions and interpretations. If they, on the other hand, have shown themselves to be disrespectful of rules and are of the tendency to stretch exceptions, then they have to make the rules considerably stricter and apply them more forcefully. With all due respect, Director Deutsch, I would suggest that there is sufficient evidence on the part of the CIA to put them in the secondary category rather than the first. There is no exception, no formal exception in the law to very many things such as speeding or burglary, although it is much easier to conceive of circumstances that were grave enough to force you to speed or break into somebody's house than there is around the question of using journalists as intelligence sources. I find it very difficult to conceive of journalists being, I find it very difficult to conceive of journalists having information of any such importance to the nation and keeping it to themselves. It's against nature, I would think. I would suggest to the committee that the insistence of the CIA on the formal exception in this way, no matter how strict, in this very public debate to a principle they seem to accept very well, that is, journalists, clergy, and Peace Corps people are put in danger of their lives by this suspicion, already does harm, that it increases the perception on the part of many that when a journalist appears in a troubled area, that there is even a small possibility that he or she is connected to espionage. I think it is dangerous and unnecessary. I think we need an absolute and public blanket ban on the recruiting and use of journalists, clergy, or Peace Corps workers by any intelligence agency of the United States. And I also might add on the use of journalistic cover by intelligence agents. I think the whole question is a dangerous one. Thank you, sir. Chairman Spector says, thank you very much, Mr. Anderson. We now turn to Mr. Ted Koppel, well known as being the anchor of the ABC News Nightline. Mr. Koppel is a 33-year veteran of the ABC News and has been praised widely for having the in-depth analysis appearing nightly for 1/2 hour. He has been the recipient of many awards, 25 Emmy Awards, 5 Foster Peabody Awards, 8 DuPont Columbia Awards, 9 Overseas Press Club Awards, and the list goes on and on. We welcome you here, Mr. Koppel, and it's the rare opportunity in question and answer session to be able to pose questions. The floor is yours. Statement of Ted Koppel, anchor, Nightline, ABC News. Mr. Koppel says, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thank you for inviting me here this morning, and for this opportunity to make a few preliminary comments. As you no doubt expected, I am unalterably and categorically opposed to the notion of the CIA having the legal option of using journalism as a cover for its officers or agents. Having said that, there are circumstances under which the agency has, under what it perceives to be the greater national interest, broken American laws in the past, and I have no doubt that it will continue under such circumstances to do so in the future. Pragmatism demands that we accept that as a fact of life in the gathering of intelligence. It does not require, however, that Congress sanctions such illegal behavior with its own benediction, or that it facilitate the process by changing our laws. Let me begin by giving you the perspective of someone who has been a working journalist for more than 35 years. As things already stand, most governments, police, and intelligence agencies around the world assume that many, if not most, American journalists working overseas are, at the very least, sharing information with the CIA and probably working for the agency. Since that is the way most of them operate, it is only natural that they assume we do so also. Until now, we have been at least able to point to American law to insist that we would be breaking the law if we work simultaneously as journalists and intelligence operatives. It wasn't much, but it was all we had. Occasionally, we were even able to convince people in other countries that Americans are curiously attached to their laws, even when those seem to complicate the process of governing. It will be much easier for those foreign government and agencies if we would give them yet another opportunity to assume that the United States is, after all, just like them. It will certainly make life so much more difficult for my colleagues and me. It will also place an even greater strain on the worn thread of credibility that exists between American journalists and our readers and viewers if they are left to wonder which of us is still trying to maintain some ethical and professional standards and who among us are actually working for U.S. intelligence. Those of my colleagues who have devoted a lifetime to striving for fairness and objectivity in their work, who have genuinely reported without fear or favor, will now have to settle for the assumption that they were just maintaining their cover. How often the CIA would actually use such cover is beside the point. The relevant question is how often it would be assumed, both home and abroad, that American reporters are working with a second secret agenda. Which brings me back to my initial point. The gathering of intelligence is a difficult, dangerous, and sometimes dirty operation. That is not my judgment. That is what we have repeatedly been told by senior intelligence officers. It is they, including the distinguished current director of Central Intelligence, who explained the use of tainted assets by invoking the need to deal with crooks and thugs in the interest of protecting our national security. Oh, thought interjection there. Operation Underworld. What was that, 1942 to 1945? I'll have to come back to that another time. Anyway, getting back to Mr. Koppel's statement. Closing it out, it looks like. When, as they sometimes do, U.S. intelligence officers circumvent or even break American laws, they must reckon with the possibility that they will one day be held to account. If their arguments are persuasive, if it is true that the national interest could not be served in any other fashion, the Congress can be expected to be lenient and understanding. But at least everyone understands that a line has been crossed and that there may be consequences. If the CIA must on occasion use the role of an American journalist to conceal one of its operatives and to protect the greater national interest, it will do so, regardless of what is decided by Congress. But let that continue to be in the knowledge that a free press being endangered and that American law is being broken. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Spector says, thank you very much, Mr. Koppel. We now turn to Mr. Mortimer B. Zuckerman, who has an extraordinary resume. All the resumes will be made part of the record. An MBA from Wharton School, a Master of Law from Harvard, University of Paris Law School, and he is chairman and co-founder of Boston Properties, chairman and editor-in-chief of U.S. News and World Report, and a chairman of the Atlantic Monthly, a chairman and co-publisher of the New York Daily News. With that background, we welcome you here and look forward to your remarks. And Mr. Zuckerman says, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am not going to read all that material. If you want to, you can stop it and pause it and read through that stuff. I'm really not too concerned about the numbers. But let's go ahead and get into the statement. Mortimer B. Zuckerman, Chairman and Editor-in-Chief, U.S. News and World Report. Mr. Zuckerman says, I would like to refer to the subject by recounting the specific experience in a sense was brought up by Ken Edelman, namely the Danilov case, approximately 10 years ago. Nick Danilov, at the end of his tour of duty as the Moscow bureau chief of U.S. News, was meeting one of his sources, a man by the name of Misha, who asked Nick if he would bring him Stephen King novels as his farewell present. When they met in some wooded area in Moscow, Misha gave Nick a package as an exchange gift and immediately disappeared. Nick was immediately surrounded by the KGB, and in this package there were a series of pictures which in fact had previously been sent to U.S. News a year earlier for publication, and which we found, frankly, uninteresting, to the point that we didn't publish them. Nevertheless, he was accused of being an intelligence agent for the CIA. It turned out, however, that there was even more to the story than even this particularly outrageous incident, because on an earlier occasion, somebody had deposited a package in Nick Danilov's mailbox and asked him that he turn this over to the American ambassador, which he did. Without that package, within that package was yet another package to be given over to the CIA station chief. And within that package, there was some material which was considered to be important for intelligence interests of the United States. They asked Nick who might have given him this package. When he mentioned the name of somebody, he had a wonderful name. When he mentioned the name of somebody who had the wonderful name of Father Potemkin, a name that apparently did not even raise any hackles or any suspicions. Nonetheless, the CIA then tried to contact Father Potemkin and used Nick Danilov's name in the process, so that in one sense his name was now being associated with the activity on the part of the intelligence service. I mention this because I think, if I understand this correctly, this may very well have been inconsistent with the guidelines of the CIA for the use of journalists, and I think it gives an example of the degree to which journalists are exposed in the greater interests of the intelligence interests of the United States. I do not wish to suggest that these intelligence interests are not serious or substantial or legitimate, but obviously they're another set of interests which are equally serious, substantial, and legitimate. So whatever gains may be justified and whatever grounds may be used to justify intelligence work by the press in whatever form it may take, it seems to me that these gains must be assessed in the context of what they do to the press as the institution of a free society. The central role of journalism is that of a constitutional check on government, and not as an instrument of government. I think that the notion of trust and confidence in the press and their objectivity as seen by our readership is critical. Any association, it seems to me, with a government agency, or particularly with intelligence services, undermines the credibility and greater good done by the independent journalists. Untainted journalism today is likely to do more good for America, it seems to me, than anything that the occasional journalist acting on intelligence might accomplish for the intelligence purpose. The independence of journalists and journalism is a precious national resource, and it is in its independence from government that journalism renders to government its greatest service. So, I would share in conclusion that these prohibitions must be, if anything, increased and made more absolute. I do not do this, frankly, just on the basis of the risks that are associated with journalists serving abroad. In a sense, I think there is a widespread understanding that journalists assume certain risks when they serve abroad. I really do it because I think it undermines the very critical and constitutionally protected role of journalism. As I said, I think here is the greatest service which journalism can do to America, is to continue to serve in this constitutionally protected independence from government. It is not enough, in my judgment, to say that if an individual consents, that is, if he is willing, that he therefore should be available as a resource or asset for the intelligence services, because the effects of this individual's decisions go way beyond what this individual may or may not be involved with. I think it affects the role of the press, and it affects the security of the press. It affects the integrity of the press. It affects the credibility of the press. And all of these, in my judgment, are critical enough so that they should be maintained through a greater prohibition than presently exists today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Spector says, thank you very much, Mr. Zuckerman. The report by the Council on Foreign Relations, released earlier this year, Making Intelligence Smarter, the Future of U.S. Intelligence, has brought this issue into public view and, as noted earlier, produced legislation in the House of Representatives by a very lopsided vote, 417 to 6. And it does involve the public discussion of a very sensitive issue. I would like to start with you, Mr. Anderson, and your comment about your personal reluctance to talk about the matter publicly. The issue is, what kind of a judgment is to be made here? Is it to be shoveled under the rug? Is there to be a public policy determined by Congress? You have already had the House of Representatives act. The Senate may or may not act. We have the choice on that. But we are looking at some very specific legislation in the House. It is a matter for the Intelligence Committee oversight as to the policy, or as to what the policy is. And you, of course, were a major victim of being suspected of being a spy. How significant a problem do you think that this is for journalists on an ongoing basis? I think there would be a considerable interest as to some of the details as to what you went through, what kind of price you paid, as a suspect journalist. Yes, sir. I consider it very significant danger. I am the only journalist working in the field to have his life threatened and put in danger by the suspicion that he or she was a spy. It's not the only one. Not the only one. Chairman Spector says, how frequent is the problem, Mr. Anderson? Mr. Anderson responds, depending on who you're dealing with, I think it is fairly frequent. You begin with the presumption on the part of many people. For instance, it is true among many of the fundamentalist Muslim groups that were prevalent in Lebanon during their civil war, that all journalists were spies, and particularly American journalists. That was just assumed. I believe that the only course that would accomplish any great healing for the damage that has already been done would be the restatement of a flat ban without exception. I don't think there is anything else that could help the situation right now. A statement of formal exception, no matter how hedged, no matter how restricted, would simply be an acknowledgement to those who suspect us of being spies that, yes, on occasion, you are right. And that, I think, is a very dangerous thing. My captors, while they treated us at times very roughly, and there were those in our group who were subjected to torture, did not actually torture me. They interrogated me a number of times, and quite roughly, and insisted. To give you an example for the way their minds work, one of the questions they put to me quite often was, give us the name of your FBI agent within the Associated Press. Give us the name of your CIA agent within the Associated Press that you report to. The assumption being, of course, that there was one. And of course, there wasn't, never has been, and never will be. They asked me many questions on the assumption that I had some contact with intelligence. They were not satisfied for a good long time. I'm not sure that they were entirely satisfied now with my complete denial or my attempt to explain the role of the press in the United States. I have had, on other occasions, had loaded weapons pointed at my head by screaming militiamen, shouting, "Spy, spy." I know many of my colleagues have been in the same or have had the same experience. There is no way to tell how many journalists have actually died because of this suspicion. The CPJ keeps tracks of attacks on the press, and we relate some. I believe it was 55 last year. Journalists dying in the course of their duty. Interjection here, CPJ being the Committee for the Protection of Journalists. Anyway, back to the statement. But their circumstances are generally fairly obscure, and they occur in places where this is difficult to pursue an investigation, and where there is generally no recourse in the courts or to the police. So, we don't know how many more, or how many more than 50 journalists died because of such suspicions. I think most of us assume that at least some of them did. Chairman Spector said, Mr. Koppel, the House had its bill, and its initial form was an absolute prohibition. And then an amendment was offered which gives the national security interest exception for the president to make a determination which is fairly frequent on some of our public policies, which we attach prohibitions to. But to make a national security exception. I understand your view being totally opposed to an exception, but why not an exception to extraordinary circumstances? Hostage taking, weapons of mass destruction, something that the president would have to make a determination on personally, Mr. Koppel? Well, first of all, Mr. Chairman, as you've heard, the director of the CIA objects even to the kind of a modification where it would have left, as I believe you suggested, in the form of something equivalent to a presidential finding. I would have less trouble with that. Indeed, I think you can infer what I say. My assumption is that the CIA is going to do what the CIA has to do under the circumstances of extreme emergency. If lives are at stake, if the national interest is genuinely threatened, then I think that regardless of what Congress finds and regardless of what laws are in place, that our intelligence community will do what it has to do. I would simply like the reassurance of knowing that there was a legal line in place and that those people who are violating the law recognize that there are many or may be consequences for that. By removing these kinds of consequences, you simply create a circumstance where there is absolutely no prohibition against this kind of thing, and we are left with the goodwill, the professionalism, the assumption that the motives of the director and the deputy director of the CIA are similar to, and they certainly are not parallel to or equivalent to those of a country that believes in a free press. Chairman Specter, well, you pose an interesting conclusion to official action, even in the face of a prohibition, that they will do what they have to do, even if it violates the law. Mr. Koppel, well, basically, isn't that what a finding is, Senator? I mean, it gives the president, and only the president, as I understand it, the ability to say that the intelligence community and to pass on to the Senate and Congress his opinion that the national interest of the United States is so in jeopardy that it warrants bending the law, breaking the law. All I am saying is keep the law in place and make it at that rare an occurrence. I don't like the idea that this being done at the convenience of the director of the CIA or the deputy director of the CIA. Force them to go to the trouble or of bothering the president with it. I guarantee you then they are not going to be doing it every day. Chairman Specter, well, I understand more fully what you mean. I had thought you had spoken that the law would be violated, but the law is not bent or broken when the president makes a finding. That is a legal exception under very tight guidelines. Mr. Koppel says, that is exactly right, sir. Mr. Specter says, so, when that is done, the law is being observed. Mr. Koppel says that is exactly right, but it would preclude the CIA or any intelligence agency doing it on its own. Chairman Specter, well, we prize ourselves very, very highly of being a nation of laws and laws that cannot be violated even by the president. We have precedent for that with the Supreme Court having said so. The president himself is another citizen when it comes to this. Mr. Koppel, with all due respect, sir, we also have precedent for the intelligence agencies of the United States routinely violating laws and simply assuming that they won't be held to account. All too frequently, I am afraid, they are quite right. Chairman Specter, well, I think that it is because, hang on. Well, I think that is because they are not detected, it is not because they are not held to account. They are not detected. The hard part is to find out about it. The toughest thing is to find the facts. Find the facts, and there is less problem of agreeing on what the appropriate policy is if they can find the facts. But finding the facts is very, very hard. And that is a matter of congressional oversight. And we do too little of it. We did a job in this room of what happened at Ruby Ridge when we found the facts and had some very fundamental changes by the FBI itself on the use of force in a constitutional context. This is a matter of great public concern that we really ought to thrash out and decide what we want to do in a very deliberative way without just delegating it, lock, stock, and barrel, to the CIA director. However much we may approve of the current use on an informal basis. It is a matter of great public policy. So, the essence of your conclusion, Mr. Koppel, is that would be a satisfactory conclusion to make it formalic. The president has to make a finding. It has got to be in writing, which requires deliberation and then notification to the oversight committees for this rare occurrence. Mr. Koppel, I am reluctant to agree totally with you, Senator. While I can understand that you infer that from my remarks, my preference is that the law simply remains in place, and that if the law currently gives the president the capacity to override the findings of some kind, then I am afraid that it is going to have to be acceptable under the extraordinary circumstances. Chairman Specter. So, Mr. Koppel, we have no statute which governs this matter. It is up to the policy of the CIA director as to what he will do and what his judgment requires. Mr. Koppel, I think that would be unacceptable, sir. Okay, I can't. I gotta insert here. I'm standing pretty strong with Mr. Koppel at this point. Anyway, back to it. Chairman Specter, well, that is the current status of the law. That is why the House has acted on the matter, and that is why we are considering it. Mr. Zuckerman, you articulate the constitutional check on the government, on the independence of a free press. And while you do not cite First Amendment guarantees as something which would be broad enough to exempt the media, and of course the most famous statement in Jefferson's, he would prefer a government. He would prefer newspapers without government than government without newspapers. Do you think that the current state of the law inhibits news coverage? Is it a problem, the coverage of the news around the world? Mr. Zuckerman, well, I think if, as we have all discussed here, it is now understood that there are circumstances under which the press may be used or involved in intelligence work, and as I tried to cite from personal experience of the U.S. News, I've seen where that has been invoked. It seems to me that you do have a consistent inhibition on the ability of the press abroad to serve its function. To bring, as Ted said, without fear of favor, by frankly, to make the most probing and aggressive reporting possible. It is too easy for government officials abroad, especially those subject to this kind of probing, to be able to dismiss these people as being, in a sense, intelligence agencies. So, I think that have a balancing of interests, and I would argue that the value that is served by having a press that is untainted by any possible association with intelligence, who bring back day after day, week after week, and year after year as much unvarnished reporting as they possibly can. Something that I believe would be inhibited by the possibility that there may be some association with an intelligence service. I think that value, particularly if you put it in the context of the unique role of the press in our society, both legally and publicly, and I think that value justifies the elimination of those circumstances, rare though they may be, from where the press may be involved. There are two national interests, in a sense, involved, and I think the ongoing day-to-day, week-to-week, year-to-year role of the press abroad in terms of what it brings back to this country in the way of knowledge and intelligence made available to its readers, to its viewers, and made available without qualification, without any sense on the part of the public that they may be involved in some way in a government mindset, and particularly as they do their reporting abroad. Whatever inhibitions the possibility of their association with intelligence services may present, if those inhibitions could be eliminated by an absolute prohibition, I frankly think it would serve this country's interests better by having this unfettered role of the press to bring back this information than preserving any suspicion and taint, even though it may be unique to very particular circumstances, whether it be approved by the director or whether it be approved by the director and by the president. I just think that in this balance, which is what we are, it seems to me, seeking here, that the balance should tilt in the favor of day-to-day, week-to-week, year-to-year reporting role for the press abroad and bringing that information, knowledge, and news back to this country. Chairman Specter. So you would argue for no exemption at all, not even a presidential finding on showing of national security interest? Mr. Zuckerman, that is correct. Personal thought. Yeah, I agree. Anyway, Chairman Specter, you have seen in your capacity as the leader of a major news organization that it is a substantial inhibiting factor on news coverage and informing the American people and the people of the world as to what is going on. Mr. Zuckerman, well, I think it, as I tried to illustrate with the story of Nick Vanilloff, I mean, there was a journalist who was arrested. It clearly had a chilling effect. It seems to me, on the whole, journalistic community in the Soviet Union at the time, he was indirectly involved in an association with the CIA through behavior on the part of the CIA that contributed to, although I'm sure it wasn't the sole reason why he was, in fact, arrested, because there was, as you know, the arrest of a Soviet spy here, Gennady Zakharov. And this was really a trading bait kind of situation. But the cover, the patina of Intelligence Association was therefore sort of in place on the part of the Soviet Union. And if you read George Shultz's description of this in his autobiography, you will see how he felt this weakened his ability to negotiate with the Soviets on this. I do think there are certain limits that are in place as a result of the possibility that there may be an association between the press and the intelligence services of the United States. As I say, yes, there will be individual and specific situations where the press may be uniquely helpful in a particular situation, but I think there is a cost to that. It is not just the cost of personal security and lives of journalists. Virtually every journalist who has been arrested, every American journalist who has been arrested over the last 50 years has been arrested on the grounds that somehow or other he is involved in intelligence for the United States. It just seems to me that there is a much greater value to having the greatest degree of flexibility and freedom on the part of the press as it serves abroad to bring back whatever they can in the way of information and knowledge. If that is going to be effective on day-to-day, week-to-week, year-to-year basis, which I believe it is, I think there is value to eliminating the inhibition and that limitation, even though I recognize that there are other situations, unique though they may be, when the press would perhaps have a positive role to play in a particular situation involving national security, whether it be the kidnapping, of American hostages, or even a situation where some terrorist organization hopes to threaten the United States with some kind of weapon of mass destruction. Chairman Specter. Mr. Adelman, you are the defender of a greater access to more sources. You've heard very strong statements made here. Would you settle for a law which allowed the exception, but only on a finding with the president's direct judgment? Mr. Adelman, I have really no opinion. I have no opinion because the DCI's findings and the president's findings, since I'm in the minority and three gentlemen I respect very much see this issue differently, let me comment on Terry Anderson, who served so nobly as a personal hero of mine. Nonetheless, he is caught in a massive contradiction. For he was apprehended and held because of an alleged association to the CIA. Although it was not true, there was nothing that he could have done to explain that he was not working with the CIA. Journalism is inherently a dangerous profession. Everybody who goes into journalism knows that very well. There is no way to prevent journalists from seeming to be tainted. There's no way to prevent it. He's right. Continuing, Terry Anderson makes a very good point that his captors have strange minds and see the world in bizarre ways. If that is true, they are not going to know the distinction between the DCI's findings and the president's findings. They don't follow the New York Times carefully on a day-to-day basis. When Ted Koppel, who I really think is wonderful and does most of America, or as does most of America, says the CIA routinely violates the law and is not held accountable, I think he's in a time warp. That was a problem in the 70s. I do not think that it was a problem after that. My experience in government has been that the CIA is, if anything these days, because of the revelations of the 1970s, too timid and too cautious, rather than too bold. And, all due respect, I find Ted's argument quite perplexing that the CIA will violate the laws. Wow. Okay, sorry. Not sorry. He would like to have a law prohibiting any kind of association, obviously, between journalists and the CIA. Therefore, if you need to act and part of, in the kind of scenarios I was talking about, involving hostages, whereabouts, or nuclear devices, he would say, well, the CIA will break the law. I don't want a system, and certainly, Mr. Chairman, I know that you don't, where to do a reasonable, rational thing requires breaking a law. There is something wrong with our system if that's the recommended course. Finally, let me say that when Ted says that he worries about his readers and viewers' respect, and that is indeed something to worry about, every opinion poll of the public respect has journalism among the lowest and the CIA among the highest, or among the top. Yeah, there's lies, damn lies, and statistics. Moving on. So I think that according to the American people, the CIA is a very respected organization, even with its problems, while journalism is not. So maybe Ted Koppel's profession would be helped and not tainted by associating with the CIA. Holy cow, really, dude? Whoa, man. All right, continuing. Last, more Zuckerman, when he talked about the Danilov case, is in a perfect illustration again of my point when he mentions that a journalist has been arrested because of suspicion of his link with the CIA. That suspicion will always exist regardless of what laws or exceptions happen right here. Ted is obviously right, Ted is absolutely right when he says most foreign countries don't have this prohibition. I don't think any country has the prohibition that we are talking about here. So the wide suspicion is that journalists will work for their intelligence agencies, and many of them do, including among our European allies. So that is the way the world works. I think that to create a situation where we have to break the law to protect American lives, or to protect American cities, or to stop weapons of mass destruction would be a terrible conclusion to this debate. Chairman Specter, Mr. Koppel, would you care to reply? Mr. Koppel, yes, sure. First of all, why don't we go all the way then? Why don't we just simply enlist all American foreign correspondents overseas with the CIA and be done with the nonsense of assuming that they had nothing to do with each other or with one another? It seems to me that the great paradox that is inherent here is that people overseas, because we gather so much information, because in fact journalists are in the intelligence gathering business, and because we distribute it so widely, because we tell everybody exactly what we know back here in the United States, we share with our consumer, including the CIA, everything we know, sometimes more than we know. Because of that, the assumption is that we are somehow connected with intelligence agencies overseas. It's only back here in the United States that the assumption is made by the intelligence agencies themselves that if only somehow they could get us to work for them, there would be more information that we are somehow keeping to ourselves, that we share only, I don't know with whom, perhaps with our managers, perhaps they're with our wives and sweethearts, that if only they could get us to work for them, they would have more information. I'm not altogether sure sometimes what it is that my friend Mr. Adelman thinks that we are protecting back here. If not those aspects of the United States that were totally different from other countries. Among them, the kinds of protections that people are given when they have been arrested. Among them, the kind of, and I realize it is difficult to use the term purity and connection with anyone engaged with the business of journalism, but this sort of perceived purity that exists, at least in terms of what our freedoms are. Among those freedoms is that we are not connected with the government. I think it really will have an adverse effect on the way that our consumers, our readers, our viewers perceive what we say, and if the assumption has to be made that some or all of us are working for the government at any time. That is not my job. Chairman Spector says, Mr. Zuckerman, do you care to reply to what Mr. Adelman said? Mr. Zuckerman says, yes. I think just to comment on his reference about Nick Danilov, I think the reason why Nick Danilov got involved with the KGB was the fact that they had a previous connection between him and the CIA, in which Mr. Danilov was, in a narrow sense of the word, unwitting. So I think, in fact, CIA did involve Nick Danilov in a way that may very well be precluded by the rigorous application even of the present law. But again, I would like to just say that to follow on what Ted Koppel says, I think journalists who are working abroad as reporters are trying to bring back as much information as they can, and I think that is the role they serve, and it is an important role. I think we see the degree to which this country, in the event of a major crisis, watches the news media or reads the news media to realize how important that is. I think anything that inhibits that sort of regular flow in the ordinary course of work of a journalist, it is a real limitation on its role and its value to this society as a particular source. At least independent information, or at least of independent information. I do recognize that there are situations such as the ones you mentioned, where there is, as I say, a hostage situation, or even the possibility of a terrorist act of one kind or another, where the journalist happens to have particularly unique knowledge or access. There is some value to having him involved. But if you do that and you do not have the absolute prohibition, given what it seemed to me has transpired both publicly and given the attitudes that are prevalent around the world, not that all of them are going to be eliminated by anything that is said or done in this country, but I do think that it would contribute in many places and in many ways to a greater access of American media abroad to what they have to do, which is to report and to ferret out information and to send that information back without any sense on the part of the countries where they are serving that, in fact, they may be involved with the CIA and obviously back here as well. So, I have to trade off two values. And I come out in favor of continuing use of the press as a resource to provide independent information to American people. That is their role in this society, and I think it would, not to be totally compromised, but may very well be compromised in certain ways under these circumstances. And I would rather eliminate that possibility and have them serve that day-to-day, year-to-year function, even though in some other individual situations they may need to be able to be used where they may be useful. Chairman Spector says, Mr. Anderson, I see you seeking an opportunity to reply. Mr. Anderson, yes, sir. I would ask Mr. Adelman that because there is widespread suspicion in such areas that journalists are involved in espionage, why do we have to increase that suspicion with a formal provision for circumstances in which it might be true? We should be working to reduce the suspicion, which all journalists do, not increase it. Because there are circumstances which we can all easily conceive of in which it might be necessary to break into somebody's house to, or do we need to formally provide for those circumstances in the law that says burglary is illegal? I don't think so. I cannot in any way limit the choice of an individual, no matter what his profession or his ethical standards, to provide information in circumstances that seem necessary to him. That's not really an issue here. I don't think any journalists who really and truly believe that lives were at stake or that there is a great danger to the country would keep such information to himself. He might choose to make it generally public, or he might choose to pass it on to somebody who will act on it. But it would certainly not remain a secret. What we are concerned with is the acts of the CIA. We are concerned with their understandable but eager search for information in all circumstances and from all people, and for the possibility that they might provide their own agents and professional agents with covers as professional journalists, which has happened in the past. I believe that we are all aware of that. I don't want the CIA to do anything to increase the danger to us, and I don't want to follow the CIA or allow the CIA. I don't want to, and we don't want to allow the CIA to believe that there are any circumstances in which they may legally contemplate that, even though we acknowledge that they probably will. Chairman Specter, do you want a short rebuttal, Mr. Adelman? Mr. Adelman, yes, I will be short. Of course, we have procedures for burglary when it's for law enforcement. That is guaranteed by the Constitution in our search and seizure procedures. That's a perfect illustration of what I'm talking about. There may be an overriding reason and a court procedure to do that. When Ted Koppel says he doesn't know of any information that journalists keep, most of the time that is absolutely true. But there are, in Ben Bradley's book, cases where journalists find something that is very sensitive, that would do more damage than contribute. And so he holds the information. We would hope that most journalists do that. If they knew the start of the Gulf War, for example, it was better just to hold that information for 12 hours and not go broadcasting it, because it would certainly help the enemy. Let me say, I'm not talking about signing up every journalist. I'm not talking about a situation where the CIA gives directions to somebody that could be extremely harmful. I'll give you a clear example. When Terry Anderson was being held hostage, if the CIA knew that he were alive, he would not probably be in one of, or that he would most probably be in one of two places. And if a journalist was in good contact with the captors, or those close to the captors, and this was a critical piece of information that they really couldn't get elsewhere, whether Terry Anderson was alive, I see nothing wrong with the CIA station chief talking to the journalist. He'd say, listen to my situation. I want to know one simple fact. Is Terry Anderson alive? I don't know how you get that information. Maybe ask to interview him, maybe by talking afterwards, whatever it is. But I need that information, and I can save his life by knowing that. And so do I think that's wrong? No. I think that's absolutely fine. In fact, noble. Chairman Specter. Well, I think it's been a very useful discussion. I have two final questions, which I think lend themselves to yes or no, but I don't like any imposition of that. Which I like, which I'd like, or which I'll ask Mr. Zuckerman, Mr. Koppel, and Mr. Anderson. Do you think if there was an absolute prohibition in American law that the CIA could not use journalists, Peace Corps members, or clergy, that would be a significant improvement in their safety, that would be recognized by people around the world who are currently suspicious? An absolute prohibition. Would it make a big difference, Mr. Zuckerman? Mr. Zuckerman. Yes. And increasingly over time. Chairman Specter asked Mr. Koppel. Mr. Koppel. I think it would make some difference, but I think it would make an even greater difference, Mr. Chairman, if, in terms of our fading credibility, as Mr. Adelman points out, here in the United States. Chairman Specter. Would it make a big difference, Mr. Anderson? Mr. Anderson says, I believe it would make a difference. I don't know how large. I do believe that, I believe that institution of a formal exception to the prohibition on using journalists would cause great damage. Chairman Specter. Okay. That's the final question. That's it. Would there be any significant difference as to how people around the world would treat journalists, as to how people, or I'm sorry, that's the final question. That is, would there be a significant difference as to how people around the world would treat journalists, subject them to danger if the prohibition were absolute or if the prohibition had a limited exception of the finding by the president? Mr. Zuckerman. Mr. Zuckerman in response, I think there would be some difference. Again, these are things that are very difficult to quantify. But I think people abroad would not be able to see the situations in which there is a specific exemption as a result of a presidential finding. Chairman Specter. Mr. Koppel, do you think it would make a big difference if there were an absolute or a very limited exception for the president through a finding? Mr. Koppel. No, sir, I really don't. I think in that respect, Mr. Adelman is right. I think that that's a distinction that's probably lost in most observers overseas. Chairman Specter. Mr. Anderson. Mr. Anderson. I have to agree with that, except, again, I would suggest that there have been indications in the past where presidential findings were not either clear or clearly observed. Chairman Specter. We thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming in. Mr. Koppel. Thank you. Chairman Specter. We appreciate your wisdom. I'd like to call our next panel now. Dr. Don Argue, President of the National Association of Evangelicals, accompanied by Dr. John Orme, Executive Director of the International Foreign Mission Association, Sister Claudette Laverde, Verder, President of the Marinol Sisters, Dr. Rodney Page, Deputy General Secretary of the World Church Services. Pause. And you know what? I think this is where we're just going to have to cut off for part 2 and have set up to roll into part 3. This has turned out a bit longer than I expected it to. I hope that you have found some of this insightful. I can see I'm going to be going back to some of this material at points in the future there's some good stuff in here. Anyway, thanks for hanging out, especially if you made it to the end. And I hope to have part 3, the last part of this, up here pretty soon.
Good evening. I'm Lyle Lott. And in the news today, we cover trivial stories to distract you from what's really going on in the world. It's 5 o'clock, and here's what we want you to think. We'll pay attention to the scene.